I am writing under a state of extreme mental agitation. For tonight, I intend to vanish into oblivion. I am destitute, and the elixir that alone makes my existence tolerable is nearly exhausted. I can no longer endure this torment. Therefore, nothing remains but to hurl myself down from this attic onto the filthy street below. Do not consider me weak-willed or a degenerate for my slavish dependence on morphine. When your eyes run over these pages, hastily scrawled by a trembling hand, you will at least partially grasp, though not fully comprehend, how I have reached the point where death or oblivion seems a desirable outcome. Fate decreed that the packet boat on which I served as supercargo was attacked by a German raider in the most desolate and seldom traversed part of the Pacific Ocean. The Great War had only just begun, and the Hun's fleet had not yet sunk into the depravities that would come later. Our vessel became a legitimate prize, and we, the captured sailors, were treated with all possible civility. The watch over us was not strict, which allowed me to escape on the 6th day in a small, frail boat, taking with me supplies of water and provisions sufficient for a long journey. Having surrendered to the will of the waves, I had only a vague understanding of my location. Being no skilled navigator, I could only roughly determine by the sun and stars that I was south of the equator. Of longitude, I had not the slightest notion. Futile, too, was the hope of soon sighting a strip of shore or a solitary islet. Day after day, calm weather reigned, and I drifted under a scorching sun, awaiting an encounter with a ship or a current that would carry me to inhabited land. But neither occurred, and I was gradually overcome by despair at the realization of my utter solitude amidst the boundless blue desert. The change occurred in my sleep. I cannot recall the details, for my sleep, though restless and filled with visions, was prolonged. Upon waking, I found myself half sunk in the slimy surface of a repulsive black mire that stretched in undulating waves to the very horizon. My boat lay nearby upon this unstable surface. Strangely, my first sensation was not horror, but an inner, chilling cold born of the air and the rotting soil. A stench arose from the skeletons of decaying fish and other indescribable objects protruding from the vile sludge. Words cannot convey the full loathsomeness of that landscape. Not a sound around, only the limitless expanse of black mire and the very absoluteness of the silence. The uniformity of the scene pressed upon my mind, evoking a fear that rose to my throat. The sun shone from a sky that seemed almost black in its cloudless nakedness, as if it reflected the ink-like swamp beneath my feet. Clambering into the boat, I concluded there could be only one explanation. A monstrous submarine volcanic eruption had thrust portions of the ocean floor, layers that had lain hidden beneath immeasurable depths for millions of years, up to the surface. The extent of the new land beneath me was so vast that I could not hear the slightest murmur of ocean waves, nor were any seabirds visible, which would ordinarily gather for carrion. For hours I sat in the boat, which provided meager shade as the sun traced its course. At sunset, the soil grew less viscous. It seemed it would soon be dry enough to traverse. I slept little that night, and the next day gathered my meager bundle, preparing to search for the vanished sea and possible salvation. On the 3rd morning, the soil had dried enough to walk upon with ease. The stench of rotting fish was maddening, but I, driven by my goal, strode forward, disregarding such minor discomforts. All day I walked westward, guided by a distant hill that rose darkly from this black desert. Sleeping in the open, I continued my journey the next day, yet the hill seemed no nearer. Only by evening of the fourth day did I reach its base. The hill was far higher than it had appeared. Due to an adjacent valley, it rose sharply to the sky. Too exhausted to begin the ascent immediately, I lay down by its slope, painted by the sunset. I know not why my dreams that night were so insane, but I awoke in a cold sweat even before the rise of the gibbous, unnaturally swollen moon. The visions were too terrible to endure further sleep. And then, in the cold lunar glow, I realized my error. I should have traveled by night, sheltering from the blistering sun by day. Now, feeling a surge of strength, I picked up my bundle and began the climb. I have already spoken of the fear inspired by the monotonous plain, but that was a trivial fright compared to the icy terror that seized me atop the hill. Looking down the other side, I saw a bottomless chasm, a black abyss where the light of the moon, not yet risen high enough, could not yet penetrate. It seemed to me I stood on the world's edge, peering into the chaos of eternal night. Before my eyes flashed remembrances of fallen angels and Satan's ascent from the abyss. As the moon climbed higher, I discerned that the slopes were not so sheer. Ledges and outcrops offered footing, and after several hundred feet the steepness gave way to a gentle incline. Moved by an impulse I still cannot explain, I began to descend the nearly vertical wall, clutching at stones until I stood upon the gentle slope, staring into the Stygian gloom where no light had ever reached. And then my attention was caught by something on the opposite slope, about 100 yards above. A huge object, bathed in moonlight from which it had likely been hidden for millions of years, emitted a ghostly white glow. Soon I realized it was a boulder, yet its contours and placement were clearly not the work of nature alone. Upon closer inspection, I was overcome by inexpressible feelings. Despite its monstrous size and antiquity, I suddenly understood clearly that this was a carefully wrought monolith, once an object of worship for sentient beings. Astonished, frightened, and yet trembling with a kind of involuntary awe akin to that of scholar or archaeologist, I surveyed the scene. Moonlight, almost like daylight, flooded the chasm, and I made out a winding river at its bottom, its waters nearly touching my feet. Waves lapped the base of the monolith, upon whose surface I could now clearly see inscriptions and bas-reliefs. The hieroglyphs were unknown to me. Fish, squid, crustaceans, whales. Some depicted creatures clearly unknown to science. But most captivating was the carving. Across the stream were gigantic bas-reliefs, whose subjects might have inspired envy in Dor himself. The beings depicted, manlike, yet with webbed limbs, slack lips, bulging eyes, frolicked in submarine grottos, or paid homage to the same shrine. They were grotesque beyond conception, defying all proportion. One was shown killing a whale scarcely larger than itself. I decided these were gods of some ancient seafaring tribe, extinct long before the first human ancestors. I stood, gripped by reverent terror before this audacious picture of the past. And suddenly I saw it. From the dark waters, with scarcely a sound, something rose. Monstrous, loathsome, like a nightmare given form, it rushed toward the monolith, embraced it with scaly claws, bowed its hideous head, and emitted rhythmic sounds defying description. I think at that moment my sanity shattered. I have vague memories of a frantic climb back up, of returning to the boat in some delirious frenzy. I think I sang, and when strength failed, laughed uncontrollably. I recall later a great storm, peals of thunder, the fury of the elements. I regained consciousness in a San Francisco hospital. I had been picked up in the open ocean by an American ship. In my delirium, I had told much, but my words, I gathered, were not credited. My rescuers knew nothing of any risen land in the Pacific. I did not attempt to convince them. Once I questioned a noted ethnologist about the ancient Philistin legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceived his hopeless limitations and desisted. It comes at night, especially under a gibbous, swollen moon. I see it again. Morphine gave only brief respite, then enslaved me utterly. Now, having set down this full account, which will be a source of information or, more likely, of scornful curiosity, only one course remains to me. Sometimes I ask myself, was it all a phantom, a mere figment of a fevered brain as I lay delirious in the open boat under the blazing sun? But in answer, the hideously animate vision returns. I cannot think of the deep sea without a shudder at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and lumbering upon its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own loathsome likenesses on submerged granite obelisks. I dream of the time when they shall rise above the waves to drag down in their reeking claws the last remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door as of some heavy, slithering body thudding against it. It must not find me here. God, that hand! The window. To the window, quickly.